This video is sponsored by Adept Roll that will help you make decisions in 40k faster. More about them later on. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and this is another installment of the best armies in Warhammer 40k. It's a little later than usual anyway, because yesterday, the normal release date for the show, we covered the World Championships of Warhammer, which were won by Folger Piles and his Adeptus Custodes. However, that doesn't mean that other events didn't go on, and in fact, oh boy, there were quite a few of them. So as always with this video series, we're going to go ahead and break down the results of the week, go through undefeated lists from large singles events, and discuss one from each faction. So let's dive into a metagame breakdown. And actually, we're going to see that there are some pretty interesting results this time around. There were actually an immense number of tournaments this week, and we saw some frontrunners that I definitely wasn't expecting. Astra Militarum did come out in the first spot with 4 undefeated results at the Hamburg German Major 2, Renegade Open, Fantasia Fanatic, and Cross Swords War at the Westford 6. That's not too surprising, however, since a lot of the discourse most recently has been about Astra Militarum. They had a very good showing at the World Championships as well, with several placements in the top 8, and of course a runner-up from John Lennon. However, the second place will surprise you. It is Tyranids, with 3 undefeated results at the Renegade Open, All-Stars Cooldown, and GT Canis Belli. Although, to be fair, that was with an XO1 record, so 1 draw on the winning player's result rather than all wins. The Tyranid lists this week were incredible, super spicy, and I'm excited to talk to you about them as we move on. Adeptus Custodes also sidle in here, another bit of an unexpected result, but that is buoyed up by Folger Piles' placement at the World Championships of Warhammer. I do talk about his list in that video in its entirety, so I'm not going to be touching on that today, but we will talk about their other result from the Grim GT. Death Guard also had a pretty good showing, taking down the Guardian Gobbler GT, as well as with an undefeated placement at the Renegade Open. Chaos Space Marines took down the Sunken City GT and had an undefeated result at Dynasty Slayer. That was an XO1 result with a draw on their record. Genestealer Cults also saw 2 undefeated results this week as well. The Celtic Cup, a fairly large event held over in Scotland, as well as taking down the Terminator event. Good job. Orks also had 2 wins this week, the Mons Wenewiniwichi, as well as the Ghost Town Showdown. Aeldari with 2 undefeated results as well from the AZ League Fall Championship and Du Bois GT. From there, we move on to factions with a single undefeated result. Almost all the different varieties of Space Marines are represented this week. As I mentioned before, so many events. Oh my god. Space Wolves at Du Bois, Blood Angels at the Hamburg German Major 2, Ultramarines at the Battle Shocked GT, and Dark Angels at the 10th Annual Perth GT. Thousand Suns also saw some success at the Fantasia Fanatic, Drukhari at the aforementioned Terrandins event, Necrons at the Whitby GT, and last, and in this case maybe least, Tau Empire at the GT Canis Belli. I did talk about that event previously when talking about Tyranids. They actually tied with Tau Empire for the final result there, and we are going to be discussing both of those lists in this episode. So as you can see, it is going to be a roller coaster ride this week. We're going to do a little bit of a rapid fire because there are so many to talk about, but it is one of the most interesting things about one of these weekends where most of the big front runners in the world are siphoned off to a particular championship like the WTC, LVO, or in this case, World Championships of Warhammer, because we get to see a lot of other players take to the fore. Now, where to watch the coverage from this weekend? Obviously, we had a lot of coverage of the World Championships of Warhammer. That was not only over on the official Warhammer Twitch channel, but also on the French Wargame Studio Twitch channel at twitch.tv/FrenchWargame, as well as La Voix de Horus, offering respectively French and Spanish language streams and additional tables for your perusal. So lots of coverage of the World Championships of Warhammer. Du Bois GT was streamed over by our friends at Tabletop Live, as well as the Renegade Open GT was streamed by Wargames Live. If you have any other streamers that were live this weekend, go ahead and let me know down in the comment section. We always want to put eyeballs on their content. So with that, let's dive in after a word from our sponsors.
This video is sponsored by Adept Roll. Are you tired of guessing whether or not your 40k game plan will pay off?
Well, guess no more.
I'm happy to introduce Adept Roll, a dice probability calculator usable on basically any mobile device. For those who haven't used these tools before, they offer a very simple plug-in system where you can input your weapon stats versus defending stats and calculate the probabilities of certain dice results or the average amount of damage that you should expect from a particular attack sequence. Adept Roll is a mobile app designed to give you precise calculations on probabilities for these attacks. It saves you the time and effort of doing the complex math and allows you to focus more heavily on actually outplaying your opponent on the battlefield. I myself use these tools quite often in my games of 40k, especially if I'm identifying two lines of play.
Curious what the math hammer is. According to this, the average damage is 3.
Adept Roll also features profile imports from both Rosterizer and New Recruit, allowing you to import your unit and attack profiles quicker and easier for faster calculations on the fly. So take control of your 40k battles with more powerful dice insight and download Adept Roll for free on iOS or Android by following the links down in the video description.
We're going to start our discussion over here in the United Kingdom, talking about the Cross Swords War at the Westward 6 event. This one was won by Ricky Kalan, playing Astra Militarum. Now, as I mentioned before, there were a lot of Astra Militarum players who did fairly well this weekend. However, only one of them brought literally only tank commanders in their character selection. So that is what we're going to be talking about today, a true tank aficionado, if I ever did see one. Most of those other lists were fairly standard. This one, however, was starting with those 3 tank commanders with Demolisher battle cannons, one of them with Grand Strategist, so he can issue an additional order over the course of the battle round, and that's going to allow the tank commanders to order both himself and another tank if he really needs it. We're then following that up with 3 units of Catachin Jungle Fighters, 3 Chimeras to house them, and a bunch of support artillery. 2 Basilisks to slow down enemies and provide some strong indirect fire, 3 Hellhounds to strip cover from enemies and set up those Leman Russ to deal their damage, a Leman Russ Executioner that can apply that +1 AP buff, and then some nice little support infantry, a unit of 5 Tempestus Scions for scoring, as well as a Tempestus Aquilon squad. Now, this list is super awesome. It's just 4 Leman Russ, 2 Basilisks, and 3 Hellhound chassis, as well as 3 Chimeras with their attendant infantry. Everything else is largely support. It's just a big old armored company. We have some frontline fighters in the form of those Catachin Jungle Fighters and their dedicated transports. The big damage is coming out of those tank commanders, and then we have some other tanks in order to take up positions on the field and support those tank commanders with additional AP and cover ignoring bonuses. Pretty straightforward list, but I do appreciate it is something different than the standard Lord Solar Leontis combos plus some number of Tempestus Scion units that we typically see. Now, moving over to the Renegade Open, this was an 84-player event held in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and it was so large, in fact, that we had several undefeated players at the end of this event. And we'll start by talking about Tyranids and Craig Parker from Maelstrom Gaming Studios. And this list is absolutely wild because it's an assimilation swarm. Ladies and gentlemen, I talk so much trash about this disaster of a detachment, but it is always awesome to see people prove me wrong and succeed with it regardless. So kudos to Craig Parker for taking this thing to an undefeated record. This is sick. Let's dive into exactly what this army is doing. Now, I've talked a lot about Assimilation Swarm in the past, and even this particular variety of Assimilation Swarm that's rucking these double Hive Tyrants. We're running an Instinctive Defense Hive Tyrant. That's going to, when it's near a Harvester unit, give that unit fight first, as well as the opportunity to heroically intervene for free. Pretty sweet, although there is some riders on that enhancement. The model with the enhancement itself has to be the one next to the Harvester, which gets a little bit weird when it comes to positioning, but is not that difficult to pull off. We also have a Neuro Tyrant with Biophagic Flow that's going to increase the regeneration range that Harvesters have in a nearby aura near the Neuro Tyrant. And if that guy's holding back and sitting next to your backline harvester units, that's going to be a great inclusion. We also then have the Swarm Lord as well. So this list is using the, frankly, pretty solid Assimilation Swarm stratagems with an enormous amount of free technology. The Hive Tyrant here for the 2 free stratagems per battle round, 1 in each player's turn, and the Swarm Lord giving you that additional CP every turn. So you have a ton of CP to play with, and with Tyranids just being generally good at scoring, and with enough CP to constantly be redrawing their secondaries, armies like this with the double Hive Tyrant tend to be pretty strong on secondaries to begin with, which is good because Assimilation Swarm doesn't tend to otherwise be very fast. We have a Hormigaunt unit to add a little bit of that speed. They are advance and charge fast OC2 infantry, so they can flip an objective once or twice a game. A Biovore for some objective scoring as well, alongside 2 Exocrines and 3 Psychophages. The Psychophages are important here because they not only increase the survivability of your units where they feel no pain, they're also relatively difficult to kill themselves, and they're also harvesters, so they can project all of those harvester synergies by themselves. We have a unit of 3 Pyrovores. These guys are good in multiple instances. Not only are they harvesters themselves, but if you don't kill all 3 of them out of the unit, you can use the harvester regeneration because they're infantry to regenerate entire Pyrovores back into their unit. And given that they're relatively tough infantry, that can be a tough nut to crack. Also, removing cover from people for the terrain effects that's in here and the Exocrines to shoot at is never bad. We have 2 more individual Pyrovores to act as singleton utility units and harvesters themselves, alongside a terrain effects with a rupture cannon to take some pot shots at some tanks, and 2 units of 6 Tyrant Guard. Now these guys are going to be benefiting from those Psychophages. They're 4 wounds apiece at a high toughness and mediocre save, but they do have that feel no pain, and if you don't kill all the Tyrant Guard in one go, they're going to start regenerating themselves back in. And if you don't get rid of them, they're going to be able to deliver those 2 Hive Tyrants to the fight. Now, we've seen lists like this do fairly well in the past. They basically require your opponent not to have the capacity to kill all 6 Tyrant Guard in a go. If you do kill all 6 Tyrant Guard, things go really poorly for you because the list doesn't have much else going for it after that. But if you get into some matchups where your opponent is not able to crack up into their defensive profiles and one-shot them, or their dice spike a little low, then those Tyrant Guard will just run over almost anything. Watching 2 or 3 Tyrant Guard regenerate back into a Tyrant Guard unit through the use of stratagems to regrow models out of phase, as well as the standard command phase regeneration that you're typically able to do thanks to Assimilation Swarm. These guys can sort of run roughshod over armies that aren't capable of dealing with them. Pretty sweet to see Assimilation Swarm do well. Huge congratulations to this player for going 5-0 with this detachment at the Renegade Open. Now with that, let's move over down under and go to Australia. We're going to go to the Grim GT 2024, which was taken down by Tim Neal running Adeptus Custodes. Now obviously, Adeptus Custodes also took down the World Championships. I did talk about them in a whole bespoke video, so Tim's list gets its own shout out in here. And interestingly, this is also a Talons of the Emperor list. We saw Folger Piles take that to an undefeated record at the World Championships, and this detachment is definitely a one to keep an eye on. We've been talking about it for a long time as being really good, but probably underplayed, and I think that that is reversing very quickly here. Talons of the Emperor can protect your Custodian units against psychic attacks and mortal wounds with nearby Anathema Psychana, as well as having just a bunch of great stratagems. Reactive moves, fallback and charge, strength and AP bonuses, wound bonuses as well. All of those things are amazing, and while it doesn't have the same consistent damage as something like Shield Host, it is much more flexible. This list was running 2 Blade Champions, one of them with Radiant Mantle, projecting an aura that provides -1 to hit to enemies nearby him. We also had Trajan Valorous, as well as 2 units of Custodian Guard and a bunch of Custodian Wardens, 3 units of 5, all of those to attach in with the characters. We had 1 Caladius Grav Tanks to provide some backline shooting, a bunch of Anathema Psychana units in the form of 2 Prosecutor squads and a Witch Seeker squad to add a little bit of additional scouting in there, and 2 Inquisitors, a standard Inquisitor and Inquisitor Kyria Draxus. Now, there's some interesting synergies in here. Obviously, Kyria Draxus is incredible in the standard Custodian Guard squad, since she's able to benefit from the unit's rerolls when they're standing on an objective. She also benefits from their double shoot when they go to use that, and with the stratagem for +1 strength and AP on an infantry unit, you can buff her gun out pretty well. The Inquisitor also does something similar. You can also buff his ranged attacks up in the same way. away. And while he doesn't have quite the same output as the 10 2-damage shots that Draxus is putting out, he does have his Psychic Shockwave, a devastating wound torrent that definitely loves to get wound rerolls. And especially since he's also going to benefit from that double tap, when the Custodian Guard squad that he's attached to uses that ability, he actually provides a lot of infantry sweeping by himself. He also gives you CP regen potentially if you are using some of those incredible stratagems on his Custodian Guard squad, so he's a really interesting inclusion as the attachment to the second battle line unit of Custodian Guard in here. This list is a little bit less heavily armored than Folger Pyle's list, but it has a lot more infantry and certainly a lot more ranged output from those infantry, especially with that second Custodian Guard unit alongside that Inquisitor. Super interesting to see the very slight differences between these builds, but both of them being successful. All right, we're going to move back to the Renegade Open here and talk about some Death Guard. Andrew Moe went 5-0 with Death Guard at the event, rocking a huge brick of Death Guard infantry. This includes 2 Death Guard Terminator Sorcerers, one of them with Deadly Pathogen, Mortarion, a Tallyman, as well as Typhus. We have 2 units of 5 Plague Marines, no real attachments for those. We can potentially attach the Tallyman in, but sometimes he just acts as a little bit of a backline screener. He holds your home objective and generates you CP over the course of the game for relatively cheap. That's typically his contribution to the fight. These Plague Marines are just here as a pretty solid OC2 infantry unit. We do have a Death Guard Rhino to shepherd them to the fight, alongside 2 units of cultists, a little bit of shooting in the form of 2 Predator Destructors, but then attachments to all of those foot characters, including 3 units of 6 Deathshroud Terminators, the massive bricks of Deathshroud themselves, attaching in with those Sorcerers and Typhus, all of whom applied additional defensive bonuses to the unit. The Sorcerers reducing incoming damage in melee, Typhus giving enemies -1 to hit them, and with their inbuilt -1 to wound, these guys not only can take a punch, but also dish it back out. Last, and probably least, we also have some allies out of Chaos Demons, 2 units of Nurglings, as well as a Beast of Nurgle. Alongside Mortarion in the list, we have a ton of units that can bully up the middle of the table. The Cultists and the Plague Marines are available to act as more utility units, essentially. The Rhino also adds a little bit of utility to the army as well, but other than that, we're just going to be bullying the middle, moving up under the covering fire of all those Predator Destructors, forcing your opponent to move back from the center of the table with Mortarion, and then absorbing that space with massive numbers of Deathshroud Terminators. And if your opponent can't crack the Deathshroud Terminator profile, things are going to go very poorly for them. They're going to get overrun extremely quickly. So with that, we're going to move over to West Branch, Michigan, and talk about the Sunken City first annual GT. This event was run by Ben Eisenoff, playing Chaos Space Marines. Ben was running what looks on the surface to be a fairly normal Chaos Space Marine Renegade Raiders detachment, but with some spice in there as well. He has Cypher to act as a lone operative and CP tax enemies, 2 units of Dark Commune, as well as a Sorcerer in Terminator armor. Now, the Terminator Sorcerer has been kind of an interesting include since the October update. Since he got a big points cut, he's able to death hex an enemy within 12 inches and increase armor penetration against that unit by 1, which is pretty cool, although we may actually be including him for his leadership ability in this particular list. We also had a Cultist Mob, 2 units of 16 Accursed Cultists in order to attach those Dark Communes into, fairly standard stuff, although no Mark of the Hound on those guys, so they are in fact going to be not scouting, although they're pretty good off the side of the table, to be honest, with their inbuilt once per game advance and charge. You can rapid ingress them and actually get pretty deep threat ranges into your opponent's backline. We had a unit of Chaos Bikers for utility, 3 individual Predator Destructors, as well as a bunch of Jump Pack units, 1 Nurgling Squad for utility, a unit of 5 Raptors, and 2 units of 5 Warp Talons as well. Overall, pretty standard stuff. What's not standard is this 10-man Terminator Squad that's also in this list. Pretty cool to see, to be perfectly honest. The Terminators are able to provide a very consistent offensive output, and I think in this list they may just be starting on the table rather than teleporting in. The reason for that is that they get Assault out of the Renegade Raiders' detachment ability, so they're able to advance and fire their weapons as normal. Every time they make a Dark Pact, they're going to get rerolls to hit, so all those ranged attacks that they're making are going to be fairly reliable. In addition, if you attach in the Chaos Sorcerer, they get reroll advantage advance and reroll charge rolls. In Renegade Raiders, we could use the Reversed Haste stratagem to give them advance and charge and +1 to charge when targeting enemies on objectives. This gives them not only very reliable attacks, but also a very reliable threat range, even though their speed would normally look fairly slow. So they're going to be able to roll their advance, roll that d6 for the advance, reroll it if they roll bad for free thanks to the Terminator Sorcerer, then go to charge, get +1 to the charge, and reroll that for free with the Terminator Sorcerer as well. They could even theoretically use the stratagem for +1 to charge enemies on objectives, even if they come out of Deep Strike, and look for a rerollable 8-inch charge, which is fairly reasonable to hit. It's somewhere in the ballpark of a 65% chance to hit that charge out of Deep Strike with the +1 bonus and a built-in reroll. Obviously, that's not something that you always want to hang your game plan off of, but if you really need it, that's something that the Terminator squad can do for you. In addition to the fact that they've already basically blitzed your opponent down with a bunch of combi weapons at the same time. This unit's a really cool inclusion into a Renegade Raiders detachment. Very creative and not really something that I've seen in the past, and it's always cool to see this creativity come to the fore. And with that, it's time to move down to Scotland and talk about some Genestealer Cults from one of the big majors of the weekend, the Celtic Cup Grand Tournament. Now, this was an absolutely massive event, 100 players, and ran with a top cut, including a cut to the top 4 for a single elimination round. That left Innes Wilson as the winner of the event with his Genestealer Cult. And it is going to be a nice refresher since we're not talking about an Outlander Claw or a Biofangtic Broodsurge. This time around, we're going to be talking about the classic GSE detachment, the Host of Ascension. Now, interestingly, we saw some pretty spicy inclusions in this list. This includes a Clamavus, a Benefactus with Assassination Edict for +1 to hit against character units. Given that the Benefactus already has a 3+ ballistic skill, that's going to put him down to hitting on 2s, firing 1 or 2 strength 12, AP3, D6 +1 damage, ignoring cover attacks. Pretty solid if you can get that reliability up. We also then have a Primus with chink in their armor to give his unit lethal hits, alongside a Reductus Saboteur and a Sanctus. We then have a ton of Acolyte hybrids. This include 1 unit with auto pistols and heavy mining tools, alongside a full 6 with hand flamers. These guys just running those pistol weapons and their melee attacks. That was followed up by a horde of Neophyte hybrids, 5 units of 20 with all of their heavy weapons, as well as a smaller utility unit of 10. Each one of those is equipped with 2 heavy mining lasers, 2 seismic cannons, 2 Webbers, and 2 flamers. And this is where a lot of the power of Host of Ascension comes from. These guys getting sustained hits and ignore cover when they come out of reserve. They can use Primed and Reloaded to score those critical hits on a +1 value. And if you have the Primus with chink of their armor in the unit, they're also going to get those 5-up criticals for lethal hits as well, and full rerolls to hit thanks to the Primus's leadership ability. It goes without saying that these Neophyte hybrids are ridiculously strong, especially given the fact that they're able to tunnel crawl onto your objectives by deep striking 3 inches away from the enemy rather than the normal 9. Following that up, we had a couple of support units, 2 units of Pure Strain Genestealers to add some forward operators to the army, as well as 4 Achilles Ridge Runners. 2 of them were equipped with heavy mortars and survey augers to strip cover from enemies and allow their units to continuously deal damage even after the turn at which they arrived. That's going to apply their crossfire bonus plus the cover ignoring, and means that the Genestealer Cult army isn't necessarily reliant on getting the detachment ability from coming out of reserve in order to fire through cover. We also then had another unit of Achilles Ridge Runners with heavy mining lasers to benefit from one of those mortar and survey auger equipped Ridge Runners and add some fairly consistent anti-tank shooting to the list. Overall, we've been seeing Ascension hosts like these do fairly well since the beginning of the edition, although they are very different these days than they were back in the day. It is cool to see this detachment return, especially in the face of all of the other innovations that Genestealer Cult has been undergoing. And with that, we're going to move over to Finland at the Mons Venevidi, a smaller 24-player GT that was taken down by Orks. Juni Havisto took down the event with a Dread Mob Ork detachment. Dread Mob's actually been seeing a huge resurgence in the last couple of weeks. We even saw them do fairly well at the World Championships, so it's cool to see them continuously do well in smaller events this weekend as well. Now, this one was bringing some spice, including Ghazghkull Thraka. Not typically an inclusion that you see in these Dread Mob lists, but it gives you a good outlet for the WoW. One thing that the Dread Mob tends tends to not be able to do very well is make a good use of its T'au. Sometimes you use it for increased movement on Zod, Grodd, Wartsnag as a unit, but otherwise it just kind of goes to waste. In this case, we do have Ghazghkull Thraka with Makari's Banner for the lethal hits, plus he's going to get his 5-up criticals to score those lethal hits, in addition to just his incredibly powerful melee attacks as well. We had a standard Big Mech with Smoky Gubbins to give his units stealth, alongside a Big Mech with Shock Attack Gun with Git Finder Goggles to ignore cover, plus 2 additional Big Mech Shock Attack Guns, a standard mech, and a War Boss. We then had 20 boys, likely for that War Boss to jump into, alongside 4 units of Gretchen, a unit of Commandos, as well as 3 units of Ludas that attach in with the Shock Attack Gun mechs to give them hit rerolls when targeting enemies on objectives. We then had 2 Mega Knobs to attach Ghazghkull Thraka into and ensure that he can utilize his leadership ability, plus 5 Storm Boys, a Battle Wagon, a Gorkanaut that I'm sure that mech is going to be following around and giving that +1 to hit to, alongside a standard truck to carry some of this stuff to the fight. The Battle Wagon there is going to be used to carry around the 20 boys to the fight. It can't, unfortunately, embark Ghazghkull Thraka because it's equipped with that Zap Gun, but it can carry the big unit of boys, and that unit can attach to both the War Boss and the Big Mech. So that's 20 boys running up the table with probably a 5+ invulnerable save on the turn they commit into the fight, and -1 to be hit with shooting. So the counter punch is even not that strong against them. Not to mention the Big Mech is also rocking kind of a fine melee profile and benefits from the +1 to hit from the War Boss as well, so he's definitely contributing to the squad on top of that. Kind of a cool inclusion there. It's not typical we see a combined arms dread mob like this one. Most of the time they're focused almost entirely on ranged attacks, but it definitely feels a lot orkier than simply sitting back at the back of the table shooting guns and running runts and running Gretchen into the fight rather than getting the orcs up close and personal themselves. Now with that, we're going to move back to the US, where we're going to be talking about the 72-player Du Bois GT and both of the top placing players in this event. Now we had Chris Martins here take first place with Aeldari, running an absolutely character and aspect warrior packed variety of the faction. This included an Avatar of Cain, Karandros, the Vice-Arch, Yvraine, an Autarch, as well as a Death Jester with Fate's Messenger. Following that up was a Farseer. Now the Autarch was the Warlord, so Yvraine is not going to be unlocking Ynnari units for the faction this time around. We're just going to be taking standard Eldar, but we are going to have that additional CP available thanks to the Autarch. From that, we are running 5 Rangers alongside 15 Striking Scorpions. One of them can attach in with Karandros, the other 2 probably just operating as forward operators so they can run up into the center and prevent enemies from pushing on you too early. Eldar do have a penchant of being alpha struck by scouting units. There are 2 Falcons in the list as well, and the Striking Scorpions are a pretty good embarkation into the Falcons since they are fairly reliable on their hit rolls already, since they have a baked-in sustained hits, and Karandros improves his sustained hits to a critical 4+ when he charges, benefiting from the fire support off of a Falcon in order to convert their damage is really what these guys want to be doing, especially since in most situations they're going to be getting devastating wounds as well, so wound rerolls on those guys is huge. That's actually a combination that we've seen at the World Championships too, so it's becoming more and more common. We also have a unit of 5 Swooping Hawks to act as utility, plus 2 Fire Prisms for backline shooting, and an 11-member troop. That troop is going to attach up with Yvraine as well as the Vice-Arch, so we have the defensive benefits of Yvraine plus the offensive punch of the Vice-Arch. He's also adding Fight First to that unit, so they're a little tough to kill once you commit into them. And he and Yvraine are both absolute powerhouses, especially alongside the +1 to wound from the troop squad when they charge. As the Avatar of Cain is bullying the center of the table, the Scorpions are pushing the opponent back and trading with their units in the middle. This troop squad is going to hover around the middle and use Fate Ties to ensure a relatively distant charge, being able to cut down basically anything that they go into, and being relatively difficult to kill on the crackback. If you aren't able to kill them, you're not really able to charge them in melee, since they'll just kill most melee units with their fight first, so you have to shoot them down, and that's tough to do with Yvraine in the unit. This list includes a ton of Eldar staples, but it's always good to see them on the table, and I think the newer technology of the Striking Scorpions embarked into the Falcons is definitely interesting, and I'm excited to see it get more play, at least before Eldar get their new codex and all of this stuff totally changes. Now we're going to stick with Du Bois GT for one more list here, because we're going to talk about the second place finisher, John Davison, rocking Space Wolves. John was playing a Champions of Rust detachment. Not Stormlands today, everybody. We are playing more regular Space Wolves. This included Bjorn the Fell-Handed, as well as Harold Deathwolf, Ragnar Blackbane, and Logan Grimnar, plus 3 Wolfguard battle leaders on Thunderwolves and 2 Wolf Lords on Thunderwolves, in addition to a combi weapon lieutenant. This is basically a who's who of the Space Marine supplement, at least in terms of characters. We have basically all of the good named characters. We're just missing Ulrich, I guess. Where'd that guy at? Did he get left on the Storm Wolf transport? We then have an Assault Intercessor squad, likely for Ragnar Blackbane to jump into. He can give them a permanent advancing charge, and then they also give him wound rerolls, which is great because his weapon attacks a ton of times, but is not itself particularly strong. We also then had 2 scout squads, as well as 3 units of Thunderwolf Cavalry to attach all those Thunderwolf Cavalry characters into. Ultimately, fairly standard Thunderwolf Cavalry stuff. It is nice to see it in Champions of Rust, however, and not the ever-present Stormlance for the turn 1 rapid ingresses and all the stuff it does. Champions of Rust, at least, is a Champions of Rust, at least, I think plays a little bit more flavorfully and is more interesting than that Stormlance build. Now we're going to move over to Germany and talk about the German Major Hamburg 2. This one was won by Astra Militarum, but we're not here to talk about Astra Militarum today because we're going to be sticking on the Space Marine train for quite a while and talking about Simon Rosen's Blood Angels. Simon was rocking a Liberator Strike Force. This was led by a captain with Rage-fueled Warrior for that sustained hits 3. He can combo activate that alongside his extra attacks from Finest Hour and do basically 1 trillion damage. He is attached into an Assault Intercessor squad. It's all fairly standard stuff. Plus a Jump Pack Chaplain with Speed of the Parmark to give his unit fight first. He also benefits them with a permanent +1 to wound in melee that's not contingent on charging, so even on the swing back, he can actually do some serious damage, especially alongside the Blood Angel stratagem for additional strength when they are charged, making them pretty good at absorbing charges after they already attack.
I think it's also important to note here that there's a little bit of a neat combo between Speed of the Primarch and the Jump Chaplain, in that when the Chaplain is selected to fight, he punches a unit in engagement range for mortal wounds, and since he's then able to do that before that unit attacks him, thanks to Speed of the Primarch once per game, then he can potentially be inflicting additional damage to something that comes to fight him, which is fun.
We have Chief Librarian Mephiston as well as Commander Dante, an Impulsor to carry around the Assault Intercessor squad, plus 3 units of Jump Pack Assault Intercessors, just 5 of them apiece, a big unit of 10 Death Company to join in with that Chaplain and get the benefit of all those aforementioned buffs, a big unit of 6 Sanguinary Guard to benefit from all of Dante's abilities, in addition to some utility provided by an Infiltrator squad and a Scout squad, and some backline shooting from 2 Gladiator Lancers and a Predator Destructor. All told, fairly standard Blood Angels construction. It is cool to see the Chaplain in the list rather than the Lamarties that we typically see. That creates a much more offensively oriented Death Company unit, not the same level of survivability that Lamarties can offer his Death Company Marine Squad, but it is pretty cool. But otherwise, fairly standard Blood Angels fare. Now we're going to move back to Australia for the next list and stick around with non-Codex compliant Space Marine chapters for a hot minute here while we talk about the 10th annual Perth GT. This one was won by Callum German running Dark Angels, who went 6-0 with the army. This is kind of a callback to a couple of months ago. It's a Gladius Task Force variety of Dark Angels, including Azrael, a combi weapon lieutenant, some Assault Jump Pack Intercessors, 3 units of Deathwing Knights, some backline shooting from a Ballistus Dreadnought, alongside an Inner Circle Companion Squad for Azrael to hang out with, an Infiltrator Squad and Scout Squad for utility, alongside an Invader ATV, which is a new inclusion. That guy's only 60 points, but difficult to kill for its points value, and has a multi-melta, which is all pretty good, plus 2 Vindicators to take over the middle of the table. If you had shown me this list a couple weeks ago, I would have said, this is the normal list. This is the best Space Marine list that we got. It's probably been supplanted by maybe Blood Angels and like Ultramarines, but definitely still kicking around. And that moves us over to the Battle Shocked GT in Redwood City, California. A little bit of trivia about myself, but that's where I was born, in fact. This event was won by Ruben Zhao running Ultramarines. And this is, I swear, the last Space Marine list that we're going to talk about today, except for some Chaos Space Marines. We still got more of them coming. This follows in the fine tradition of the tiered list we talked about earlier, in that absolute meme detachments seeing success, because this is a first company task force detachment. One of the most inarguably trash detachments in the game, but Ruben is making it work. One interesting interesting combination here is the addition of Roboute Guilliman in the list. I think his discount in the October update has actually made First Company Task Force maybe okay to play. You might be able to find some ways to make this detachment do something. The big benefit here is that Roboute Guilliman can give you an additional Oaths of Moment target if you've destroyed your original Oaths of Moment target. And First Company Task Force once per game gives you wound rerolls on your Oaths of Moment target in addition to hit rerolls. So if you use those two abilities in conjunction, you can get wound rerolls on 2 enemy units over the course of the turn rather than just 1. Otherwise, the army was running a Terminator Ancient with the Fear Made Manifest enhancement. This destroys enemy models in units that battle shock within 6 inches of him, and once per game he can choose to destroy D3 models rather than just 1. It's excluding monsters and vehicles, but it's not mortal wounds, you just kill someone. So even if you're hitting like Custodian Guard or Centurions, you're gonna be killing quite a few points worth of miniatures every time those battle shocks get failed. Now that guy is gonna be jumping into an Assault Terminator squad. There are 5 Assault Terminators here. These guys force battle shock checks when they charge, so they have the opportunity alongside that aura to potentially do some damage before you get in with your melee attacks. We then also have a Copy Weapon Lieutenant to staple to Guilliman's butt and give him lone operative, a standard Intercessor squad to lock in your backline objective, an Infiltrator squad alongside a Reaver squad so for some early game scouting, plus a Scout squad for the same reason, a Calidus Assassin as well for some utility, and a smorgasbord of vehicles. This includes a Gladiator Reaper, Land Raider Redeemer to carry those Assault Terminators to the fight, a Repulsor Executioner, as well as both a Stormspeeder Hammer Strike and Thunder Strike. The combination of these two is great. They can give you +1 to wound monsters and vehicles with your shooting, as well as ignoring cover. That can make units like the Land Raider Redeemer or even just the Gladiator Reaper utterly lethal against a wide variety of targets. That Redeemer getting +1 to wound against monsters and vehicles is actually kind of disgusting, since it's firing those 2d6 +6 Flamestorm cannon shots and can potentially be wounding enemy vehicles on 4s with rerolls from the detachment ability. That could potentially allow the Redeemer to just absolutely torch something expensive right off the table before the battle even gets joined. Overall, this is a really technical list and has some pretty sweet combinations and is using that First Company Task Force one big surge turn of additional damage to the best of its ability. Really cool to see a list like this do well. This weekend has been absolutely insane for bizarre detachments doing pretty well, and it's friggin' sweet to see First Company getting a W. Moving on from that, we're going to talk about a staple of European wargaming, Fantasia Fanatic over in Sweden. This event was won by Astra Militarum. Again, we're not talking about Astra Militarum, we already talked about them. Instead, we're going to talk about Thousand Suns. Matthias Lindvo Ostling went undefeated with a Thousand Suns army. This one being incredibly character focused, even more so than the typically extremely character focused that we tend to see Thousand Suns be. We are running just so many characters in this list. This includes Magnus the Red, 2 Exalted Disc Sorcerers, 3 Infernal Masters. Thousand Suns are just back to their old ways, I guess, where they're running way too many Infernal Masters, plus a Thousand Suns Demon Prince with Lord of Forbidden Lore. For clarity, we have an Umbralific Crystal on one of those Infernal Masters and an Arcane Vortex on the other one. This is all classic stuff. If you watched the last 6 months of Best Armies in 40k videos, you know how all this stuff works. The Demon Prince is cool though. He will grant you stealth in an aura. You can use him alongside Magnus the Red, and Magnus actually pumps his melee attacks to do some pretty serious damage. With Lord of Forbidden Lore, he can kind of play a little aggressively and duplicate Doom Bolts and things like that for the rest of your army, and you'll have plenty of Cabal points to do so, because did you see how many sorcerers are on this list? Oh my god. Plus, he's just a really awkward defensive profile for enemies to be able to kill. He's not the hardest thing in the world to take down. He will go down with a concerted effort, but he's like a little mini baby Magnus. If Magnus has not exposed himself or is able to attack an enemy at an unforeseen angle and dodge most of the return fire, the Demon Prince, you can focus all your defensive technology, like your blank damages, and save rerolls on the Demon Prince himself, and he has good enough saves that he'll actually absorb a lot of fire, especially with that baked in stealth before he finally goes down. We then have a bunch of Rubric Marine squads for these guys to join into. That's 3 units of 5 Rubric Marines, all of these equipped with Warp Flamers. Following that up is a bunch of utility, 2 units of Chaos Spawn and 2 units of Thousand Suns Cultists, alongside a Mutalith Vortex Beast. The interesting thing about this army is that it's very light on the ground, at least in the front line. Just a bunch of characters and 3 units of Rubric Marines. It does have that 1 Mutalith Vortex Beast, as well as that 1 1 Demon Prince, but it's not really going to take a punch on the chin. It's going to have to play incredibly smart to do well, and that's really where you want Thousand Suns to be. So with that, let's move over to Spain and talk about the GT Terrandins. What a name. This event had an undefeated Genestealer Cult player, Manel Tula, but we're not going to talk about him. Instead, we're going to move over and talk about some Drukhari, who did end up winning the event. Falco La Orden was undefeated with a Skysplinter Assault variety of Drukhari. Cool to see Skysplinter Assault still doing well, even as a lot of competitive players have moved to tankier builds of Real Space Raid. This army was including 3 Archons, one with the Nightmare Shroud to prevent Overwatch, and one with Spiteful Raider to generate some additional pain tokens. We had Lilith Hesperax as well as Urian Rakarth too. This does feel like a Real Space Raiders list, right? We have the triumvirate of special characters in order to unlock those pain tokens, but it's not happening. It is Skysplinter Assault. We have a Cabalite Warrior squad as well as a Court of the Archon. We're going to split that Cabalite Warrior squad with the Court of the Archon and one of the Archons to jump into to build ourselves a little bit of a ranged platform. We then have the Venom that can carry the other half of that unit. We have 2 Chronos to regenerate pain tokens, 2 units of Incubi to attach the other Archons, alongside a Mandrake unit, 3 units of Scourges, and 2 units of 2 Talos to add a little bit of a powerful backline. What's interesting here is that we don't have any attachments for Lilith Hesperax. She doesn't really need them, to be fair. She has Fights First baked in by herself. She just benefits from the additional AP, generally speaking, from her leadership ability when she's got 5 witches running around. She's also not the hardest thing in the world to kill when she's on her own, but honestly, that normally doesn't matter, since she's going to be trying to isolate enemy infantry units that she can one-shot and keep herself relatively safe. It should be mentioned as well that we do have some dedicated transports in here, 2 Raiders and a Venom. Obviously, those are important to split the Cabalite Warrior squad and fill up a Raider with the Court of the Archon, Cabalite Warriors, and Archon, and then the 10 Incubi are going to jump into the other Raider. The Venom can disembark its Cabalite Warrior combat squad whenever it wants to, and then jump in the additional 5 Incubi to ferry them around the table as well. Fairly standard Skysplinter Assault stuff, but it is cool to see Skysplinter Assault still doing well, even as Real Space Raid is sort of overtaking it. Now with that, let's move back to Great Britain and talk about the Whitby GT. This was a 31-player event that had food included. This event, the event was won by David Leniewski, who was running a Hypercrypt Legion. This is a Tesseract Vault variety of Hypercrypt Legion, so it was the thick variety of Hypercrypt Legion we've been seeing do so well. This included that Tesseract Vault alongside 2 Doomsday Arcs and a ton of utility. A unit of Flayed Ones, a Locust Destroyer, and 2 units of Deathmark for their baked-in Deep Strike. We also then had a Hexmark Destroyer with Dimensional Overseer to allow the army to redeploy multiple units, and 3 Catan Shards, one of the Nightbringer, one of the Void Dragon, as well as a Transcendent Catan. A little bit of Catan tribal here, since we have 3 of the character varieties, plus that Tesseract Vault. Germany had a ton of events today, because we're going to move on to the GT Canis Belli and talk about this insane tie that we had in the final game between Tyranids and T'au Empire. We've already talked about Tyranids today, though, so we're going to dive into Patrick Phillips' T'au Empire list, who did ultimately win the event, but with that draw on their record. It was, to be fair, a differential scoring event, so draws are fairly common. Patrick was running a Retaliation Cadre list, and a commander-focused variety of Retaliation Cadre at that, which is one of the most high-performant lists that I've seen in a while. These things always surprise me every time I see them on the table. It seems like they would give up tons of points on secondaries between Assassination and Bring It Down, but it ends up not being the case, and they just shoot you to death before you can kill them. That includes Commander Firesight, 2 Cold Star Commander battlesuits, as well as 2 Enforcer Commander battlesuits. One of the Cold Star Commander battlesuits equipped with Fusion Blasters is taking internal grenade racks, so he's going to be jumping into a Sunforge team, moving up close to the opponent and bombing them before shooting them with a trillion high AP, high damage Fusion Blasters. The other Cold Star Commander is running the Starflare Ignition Suit. He is running high output burst cannons, missile pods, and cyclic ion blasters, and that gives him the uppy-downy redeployment effect. We then have the Enforcer battlesuit with prototype weapon system to add additional weapon keywords to his shots every time he fires. That guy's running 1 cyclic ion blaster and 3 missile pods. That guy was likely jumping into the Fire Knife team that the army included. That Fire Knife team getting those hit rerolls and equipping plasma rifles on its Crisis battlesuits.
We then had 2 Star Scythe Battlesuit teams, probably attaching that close-range weapon-equipped Cold Star Commander plus 2 Sunforge teams. Obviously, those equipped with Fusion Blasters to attach the 2 commanders that have Fusion Blasters on their profile. 1 Cold Star Commander and 1 Enforcer Commander with 4 Fusion Blasters apiece. Following that up, we have just an absolute immense number of utility units, including a Pathfinder team, a Carnivore team, 3 units of Stealth Battlesuits, 2 units of 5 Vespid Stingwings, as well as 2 Piranhas and 2 Ghostkeel Battlesuits. Largely, we are trying to swarm the center of the table with these forward operators. The Ghostkeel Battlesuits and the Piranhas can really act out in the early game, especially with the Ghostkeels jumping around the sides of the table, scoring secondaries, and holding down objectives while being untargetable. The Piranhas can move, block enemies, and keep enemies back, while potentially doing some spike damage onto enemy vehicles. And that allows you in the middle of the game to rush forward the Crisis Battlesuits, benefit from the incredible bonuses you get from being right next to your opponent, and absolutely blast them all at once over a couple of turns. We've seen armies like these and do incredibly well. I think to the point that I would say Retaliation Conjurer might be the highest upside detachment out of T'au, although it might be fighting with Cao Yan in terms of consistency. I do feel like that there are going to be some matchups that a Retaliation Cadre like this might struggle against, especially stuff that is excellent at screening out deep strikes. However, it has a wide variety of attack profiles for a wide variety of targets, so it's going to be looking pretty good almost regardless of what it's shooting at. Very cool to see armies like this do well, although obviously it did meet its match in those Tyranids with that draw in the final round. And with that, those are all the best armies of Warhammer 40k for this week. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks to Adept Roll for sponsoring this video. And thanks to everybody who supports the channel elsewhere, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing. And I love you. You really help me be able to constantly make these videos day in and day out talking about the Warhammer 40k metagame. And I really appreciate it. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.